Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining our webinar today. I hope you can all hear me okay. My name is Klaus Rothenbacher. I'm the Regulatory Affairs Advisor for BSEF. And I'll do a quick introduction before we come to the main presentations today. So I will briefly introduce BSEF and explain the background and the aims of the meeting today on the following slides, and then we come to the main presentations. First, some housekeeping. The webinar today will be recorded, and it will be made available on the BSEF website for people who may not be able to join the webinar live today. Our friends from Apeiron Consulting helped organize this webinar. Thank you very much. This morning when we checked, we had 135 registrations, so quite a number of people attending. As a default section, we switch off microphones and camera. If you have any questions at any time, you can submit them via the Q&A function. It's important to note that this is not the chat function. So if you look at the top ribbon of the program, there is the chat function, and just right to the chat function, you have a Q&A function. So please submit questions via the Q&A function. There's somebody, Tom, will collate and moderate the questions, and we'll come back to them at the Q&A section at the end. What else? Yes, here. Can we go back one slide? I forget to mention, this is new. There is, if you're joining from somewhere else in the world and you like a translation of the slides, you can have an automatic translation. You would need to go to the 3 dots at the bottom of the screen. It's in the left bottom corner, and click there. And one of the options there would be translate screen. I haven't tried it out, but it's a feature, so we hope it's working. Okay. Very brief introduction, who we are. We are BSEF, the International Bromine Council. We're the global representative body for the bromine producers and producers of brominated technologies. We're 27 years old, and you can see our members and the locations we're present on the slide here. The next slide briefly shows our mission and our activities. So basically, we're committed to foster knowledge on the societal benefits of bromine and its application, and we promote research and development of bromine-based technologies. The next slide gives a brief summary of what we're trying to achieve today. So the main objective will be really to explain what this call for evidence is about, why it's important that you respond to it, and we'll provide some regulatory background around it to explain it. And we will have some hands-on practical advice, how to respond, what to respond, and how practically also to handle the spreadsheet. You may have noticed that in the actual call for evidence, there are 3 different spreadsheets. So for the sake of today's webinar, we will focus on the first 2 of the spreadsheets, which are on use mapping. There's a 3rd spreadsheet collecting information on end of life. Although you may have information on this topic, we will not specifically discuss that at the webinar today. And Finally, a quick reminder that this meeting is conducted under antitrust guidance. We have our legal counsel present, Roxandra. Maybe we can unmute her briefly so she can give you guys the obligatory antitrust briefing. Roxandra, are you here and can you?
Yes.
Okay. So
hello, Klaus. Good afternoon, and I am unmuted. Thank you. As an antitrust reminder, this webinar is organized by BSEF with the sole purpose of providing publicly available information to any parties interested in the pending consultation on aromatic brominated flame retardants by ECHA. On this occasion, no confidential information will be exchanged, nor any other information that would be pertinent to companies' position on the market from an EU antitrust perspective. The EU competition rules apply to this event and any related discussion. Please refrain from sharing or discussing any information that would be relevant in that context. In particular, when asking questions, no information on specific uses or applications or commercial relations or interactions, intentions for marketing, or any such information shall be exchanged. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. And if there should be any doubt, I'm sure you will intervene and put us back on the right path.
Yes.
Super. I have just one more slide, then we're ready to go. And that's the agenda for today. So as mentioned, we start with a brief introduction of at the moment we're at the welcome objectives and housekeeping, which has completed that. And now we come to the regulatory background. Pete Simson will explain that to us. Pete is a consultant with Apeiron-Team, and before he joined them, he was with ECHA for quite some time and was involved in this sort of topics we're discussing today. Then we're especially happy to have a guest speaker from ECHA present, Nina Lazic. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. She will give us a first-hand explanation what the call for evidence is about and how to best respond to it. And as mentioned, we finish with a Q&A panel. 𝗃𝗏𝗄𝗁, also from Apeiron, he will moderate the question and he will pose questions then for answering at the end of or at the later part of the webinar. And we conclude with some concluding remarks from Pete. And I have to speed up because we just have 1 hour for the webinar. So I suggest we get right to it. I hand over to Pete.
Thank you very much indeed, Klaus. Indeed, it's my pleasure to speak to you all today. And I'll start by giving you a brief summary of the recent regulatory activities that have taken place around flame retardants in the European Union, with a particular focus on brominated flame retardants. In essence, what steps and processes have brought us to today's call for evidence. As Klaus mentioned right at the start, but in case anybody missed that, we do have the Q&A function active today. So if anything that I say prompts you to ask a question, please do so. If you submit it using the Q&A function, then we will be able to come back to it when we get to the Q&A session of the webinar today. Okay, so moving on, the key regulatory development in the EU recently has been the publication of the European Chemical Agency's ECHA's flame retardant strategy, which was made in March 2023, about a year ago. The flame retardant strategy considered all flame retardant chemistries, be they brominated or chlorinated or phosphate-containing flame retardants. It's considered to be an unprecedented opportunity to address all flame retardants in a coherent and consistent way. The strategy was set up to identify if there were any information needs, for example, on hazard properties of flame retardants, but also to consider holistically any uses or substances that should be considered for risk management activities in the EU. The strategy identified several potential risk management needs for different groups of brominated flame retardants, both involving the REACH restriction process. I'll elaborate those in a moment, but just to introduce REACH restrictions for anybody that isn't particularly familiar with them, a REACH restriction is any measure relating to the manufacture, use or placing on the market of a substance in the EU to address an unacceptable risk. It is possible within restriction to differentiate between restrictions with a wide scope, so affecting groups of substances and multiple uses, from a restriction that has a more narrow targeted scope that might affect, say, a single substance in a single use. And we'll get back to this a little bit in terms of the proposals or the suggestions for flame retardants. It's also important to discuss that whilst restrictions are often discussed around the fact that they can ban the use of substances, which of course they can, it's also important to note that in the past, previous restrictions have addressed unacceptable risks by requiring other measures, for example, like requiring the use of specific risk management measures, and they don't have to be a ban. So coming back to the flame retardant strategy, they suggested two measures essentially in relation to brominated flame retardants. For the aromatic brominated flame retardants, there was a suggestion for a wide and generic REACH restriction of substances where they have confirmed PBT and 𝗲𝗶𝗶𝗃 hazard properties. And then for the aliphatic brominated flame retardants, there was a suggestion for this more targeted approach to REACH restriction affecting 2 reactive alcohols in terms of their professional uses. And this was on the basis of their confirmed carcinogenic properties. So as the focus of today is really on the potential restriction of aromatic brominated flame retardants, it's useful to note that there were 2 important preconditions identified for this restriction to perhaps progress a bit further. The first was in relation to the hazard properties of aromatic brominated flame retardants, and particularly substances like EBP and TBBPA. It's of course important to note that those PBT 𝗲𝗶𝗶𝗃 assessments under the REACH substance evaluation process are still ongoing. The outcome is uncertain at the moment, and of course agreement or not on these properties will be a key milestone in terms of this ongoing regulatory strategy. The second important thing to note is in relation to some more uncertainties noted around aromatic brominated flame retardants in the strategy, and this was in relation to the releases posed by, or the releases that could occur of reacted flame retardants or polymeric aromatic brominated flame retardants at the end of their life. And this is to answer this question is, do these particular flame retardants in this use pose an uncontrolled risk at this life cycle stage? So in order to answer these questions, the flame retardant strategy proposes that there should be, prior to any restriction proposal, an investigation report to address these. And this is, of course, what's happening at the moment. Just to finish up on this slide, just to note some examples of different flame retardants that fall within these 2 broad groups, the aromatic brominated flame retardants on the left. Of course, none of these have confirmed PBT 𝗲𝗶𝗶𝗃 properties. And then these reactive alcohols, these 2, which were highlighted for a potential restriction based on their carcinogenicity on the right-hand side in this blue box here. Okay, so I'll move on very quickly now in terms of what the aims of the investigation report are. It was requested from ECHA by the European Commission, and Nina will discuss this in more detail as she goes. But essentially it was to gather further information on these flame retardants, and it should be completed by the end of this year. Its purpose is to support the European Commission as it decides in terms of what it should do next around these substances. And essentially it will be looking to answer questions that, is a reach restriction of aromatic brominated flame retardants needed? And of course, the hazard properties are important to consider there. Have they been confirmed to be PBT/PBB in this intervening period? If so, if there should be a restriction, what should its scope be? What substances should it cover? And again, what sorts of uses? Should it be all uses, or should it be on additive uses and not reactive or polymeric ones, depending on this outcome of the investigation around releases from these polymer matrices at their end of life, for example, and their service life. To support this call for evidence, ECHA has planned 2 calls for evidence. The first that we're in now, which is on uses and volumes and releases, and the second one, which will happen later in the spring, has a focus on alternatives. The call for evidence essentially poses 4 questions. The first 2 are the questions that we will get into more detail about today. So I'll only discuss those 2 here on these slides. The first is in relation to uses of the aromatic brominated flame retardants. And again, Nina will elaborate in much more detail, but they're looking essentially on a substance by substance basis. What sectors of use are these substances used in what applications, and the materials that the flame retardants are used in, and where possible to differentiate between the type of flame retardant, an additive, a reactive, a polymeric. And then as we go, there's an accompanying spreadsheet that respondents are encouraged to use when replying to the consultation. The second spreadsheet is on the tonnage information that accompanies the use. And again, it's an overall tonnage which is sought. But again, if there's tonnage information available for a specific sector or a specific end use, ECHA is requesting this as well. There are other elements of the call for evidence, and I would suggest that people take a look at this to make sure that they fully understand everything that's being asked for. It's not just use information. Information on end of life, for example, is being requested, and also information about releases that could happen at different parts of the life cycle. There isn't a spreadsheet for all of these questions, so you're free to provide information with in any format that you want for those questions that don't have a spreadsheet. Now, before I conclude my presentation discussing why we think it's important for downstream users and trade associations to get involved in this call for evidence, I just wanted to take a brief moment to introduce the wider reach restriction process and timeline, just to make sure that you have a good context. There are essentially 5 steps to the process, starting from preliminary stages at the left around investigation, leading all the way to the right-hand side on a potential implementation if a restriction is supported all the way through. You'll see that during different stages of this process, there are different actors involved. There's different layers in terms of how formal the processes are, and also in terms of opportunities for stakeholders to get involved and engaged. And as a general theme, there's more opportunities to be involved earlier in the process than there are later on in the process. And this is one of the reasons why I encourage people to get involved now. But we're here very early on in the process. If you look at the typical durations of the stages, you can already see a little bit in terms of how long a process we're in, and how long there is available to develop a particular proposal on flame retardants. We're looking at least a 5-year plus process to go from a proposal all the way to implementation of a potential restriction. And as I noted, the potential for stakeholders to shape a proposal with high quality information, of course, is considered to be greater earlier on than it is towards the end of the process. So just finishing off, why do we think it's important that downstream users and associations take part in the call for evidence? Well, the use mapping stage, it really is the foundation for all of the subsequent stages moving forwards. It's the foundation for what's called analysis of alternatives. Can the aromatic brominated flame retardants actually be phased out in their uses and replaced with other flame retardants? Can those other flame retardants achieve all of the technical properties that are required? And then this other stage, the socio-economic analysis. What would happen if those flame retardants couldn't be placed on the market and used anymore? What would be the implications, both in terms of having to reformulate, losses of performance, for example, and also covering aspects like fire safety, for example. I think just to reiterate here is that downstream users will have important information that's needed by the risk managers. ECHA and NINA is one of these risk managers. ECHA have an obligation or an aim to develop proposals that achieve an appropriate proportionate balance between benefits, so this is risk reduction, and the compliance costs when viewed from the perspective of society as a whole. So in order to be able to do that, that really is a data-driven process. And the more data that they have, the better that they will essentially be able to do their job. And the sooner that they have it, the more likelihood is that they'll be able to do that comprehensively. I'd really advise you that not to assume that the information that you have is already known. It's probably not, and it might well be crucial. And there are various elements of this which I think are important. The specific uses and applications, for example. These substances, of course, are all REACH registered, but the registered uses in the dossiers are often, well, I'd say they were always too generic really to be useful in a risk management process. A much greater degree of resolution is really needed to understand the implications of regulation of a substance. Information about how they're used and why they're used is important, like relevant technical performance requirements, relevant applicable standards. These are really important baseline information that's needed. The relative performance of alternatives against these technical performance is, of course, very interesting and useful, as well as knowing what the implications of a restriction might be. It's down to the downstream users, essentially, to be able to really say what will happen if that substance can't be used anymore. They really understand better than anybody else what the implications of a restriction might be. And then just to add just a little bit, really, just in terms of mentioning that a restriction doesn't have to be a ban, information on the potential of risk management measures to address releases, for example, will be very important as well to introduce during the process. And of course, one of the elements of the information being requested this time around is on the potential for releases. This is my final slide. Just to note a little bit about, again, about why we think it's important. ECHA's background note for the call for evidence says that in the absence of information, ECHA will use default assumptions. This is the standard way of working, of course, but it's just to note that these default assumptions will typically assume that there are releases. They'll typically assume that alternatives are available in a particular use, for example. So they tend not to favour continued use. So you really don't want to be in a situation where assumptions are being made in these dossiers, particularly if you have the information that will prevent an assumption from being used. We do have a long regulatory timeline, of course, but I think what we would say is that sharing what you have now is better than sharing nothing at all, even if it means that that information is refined as this 5-year process goes forward. And then I'll just finally mention that interventions in regulatory processes that happen late, they do happen, and they do happen a lot, but they typically only avoid worst case negative impacts, and they're most likely not optimal in terms of how you would want to approach risk management of substances. So maybe you would get an extra 6 months of a transitional period or something like this. You wouldn't get a complete redesign of a regulatory proposal at the end of the decision-making phase. You can only really influence really what a proposal looks like fundamentally by being involved right at the start. So that's me. I will now going to pass it over to Nina. Nina P, feel free to take control.
Yes.
And the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete. I start now sharing the screen. We'll go all smoothly. Okay. Just. Okay, now it's sharing the presenter mode. Okay, great. Well, you need to switch it. Wait, I just. Okay. Okay, well, thanks again, Pete. And as mentioned by Pete, I will give some more information on the calls for evidence and the question on uses. Just a brief intro. Oh, yes, my name is Nina Lazic, and as mentioned before by Pete, I will be giving more information on the calls for evidence. And I work in the unit D4 on the risk management, and I'm here with my colleague, 𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃. So yes, let's go with the next slide. This first call for evidence is targeted at information on the uses, as well as other type of information already mentioned by Pete on emissions, end of life, and analytical methods. It was launched on 7th February, and it will run for approximately 2 months until 5th of April. Gathering detailed information on the uses is critical for ECHA because indeed in the second calls for evidence, we will prepare targeted questions for the alternatives. So having a clear understanding on the applications, the different polymers, and the sectors involved is key to have granular questions on the alternatives, and so also to get, of course, granular responses from the different stakeholders. Based on this preliminary timing, the second call for evidence will be launched towards the end of April and will also last for 2 months, so until approximately end of June. In addition to have questions on the alternatives, we are also planning to have additional questions on the waste management, recycling, analytical methods, and these additional questions will be prepared indeed based on the assessment of the information that we will get through the first call for evidence. So it is a very iterative process. Some practical tips on how you may submit comments to this call for evidence. So we have to go to the ECHA website, the specific section, current calls for comments and evidence. Here you can see the link. Once you click on this link, you will be directed to another page, and then you can simply click on this link, give comments. So by clicking on the link give comments, you will be directed to another page, which is the web form that you can fill. And in this web form, there will be some initial questions, of generic nature about the company. And then there will be the specific questions, which are included in this call for evidence. And then important to note that under the section 4 and 5, you can upload all the relevant attachments. So under the section 4, non-confidential, and section 5, confidential attachments. With regard to the substances that are being in the scope of this report, as you've seen, we have published a list of 50 substances. However, as long as, when we receive additional information on other substances, so for example, on the polymeric brominated flame retardants, we will add them to the list, because the idea is really to have a clear understanding on where the different types of the brominated flame retardants are used, so including also polymeric flame retardants. So just indeed to clarify about the scope, this list of 50 substances is provisionally, and it can be indeed updated based on the inputs that we are expecting to receive during the different calls for evidence. Also, additional tips and considerations regarding question and uses. So we really recommend you to use this format so that we can collect information on the uses in a consistent manner. Also important to note is that while this Excel file on the uses has many columns, you just need to fill in information when you have, and when you don't have any information for certain columns, you can leave them empty. So it really depends on the type of information you have. An important also point is that, as you will see from the practical demonstration, there is a final column comment where you can include any additional information that you did consider relevant for the inputs. for example, clarifications on the figures provided, for example, on the concentrations, or you can include the links for the products that you're concerned, or for the different flame retardants that are like on the market. So anything that you really consider relevant and complementary to the information that you're providing for a specific use. Also, no use type information is very helpful. So, for example, if based on the current situation in the market, it's clear that certain chemicals are not used as flame retardant, or they were used, for example, in the past, and today is no longer the case. Also, this type of information is useful so that we can focus the ongoing work on the critical uses, and this also will help, as mentioned before, to shape the content of the second calls for evidence on the alternatives. Regarding the structure of the Excel file on uses, so as you can see, this can be split in three key areas. So the first columns are about general information and on how to use it. So if you have information for one specific substance, you first need to select the EC number from the column here. And all these 50 EC numbers are also listed in the other sheet too. So you don't have to, for example, include anything in the column B or in column C, because the CAS number and the substance name and also the group will appear automatically. Also here you can include your role in the supply chain. Important to note is that in case the substance for which you would like to provide information is not present, you cannot identify it because there is no EC number. You can use the second sheet called Use Mapping Other Substances. And there you can include the name of the substance in question. So this might be the case for polymeric flame retardants, but otherwise all the other columns are the same as in this sheet. Also, important to note that when you, for example, would like to include different uses for the same substance, different rows should be used. So then regarding the second part of the Excel file, here in the column F, you can indicate the end application in question from the list provided. In the drop-down list, there are around 42 different types of end applications. But if you would like to provide information for an end application which is not included in the list, you can then include information in the column Y. In the similar manner, in the column G, you can indicate the sector from the list. So, for example, if in the column F you clicked on adhesives, and maybe in the sector G you can indicate the sector of relevance. So, for example, for aerospace and defense, or another sector listed here. And then in the column H, you should include the type of the polymer to which the flame retardant is applied. So in terms of structure, you can see that for column F, G, and H, we have provided an indicative, different indicative list. So whenever you identify the element for the list, you can just click on it. However, in case you would like to provide information from a use which is not in column F, or another sector, or different polymer which is not listed in the column H, then you can write the text freely, and there are no constraints in the column, in these last three columns. And finally, regarding the different uses, in the column L, it should indicate whether the type of flame retardant is additive, polymeric, reactive. Then in column M and N, the concentration. And here we are not asking, for example, for the specific figures, but we would like to receive a concentration expressed in the range, for example, lower and upper. And And also regarding the column O, we would like to understand if the flame retardant has any other function in the use for which you provide information. So for example, if it has a function as a plasticizer or another function. If yes, then this function should be described in column P. And finally here, yes, you can include any relevant comment that can complement this information you have provided, especially, for example, for the concentration level. You may clarify what exactly this refers, so to make sure that we understand what the figures mean. Regarding the other Excel file, this is more flexible and is unprotected, so it can be changed by the user. Also, as we don't know what exact information is available, information, the volumes can be provided for example, for a single substance or for a group of substances, depending on the information available. And again, no need to fill in every column, but it really depends on the information you have. No exact confidential figures are needed, but only upper and lower ranges. And also here it's important that you indicate your role in supply chain so that we can take that element into account, avoid, for example, double countings. And again, we might provide clarifications on the figures in the column comments so that we can identify exactly to what the volumes refer to, because of course of the complexity in the supply chains. This is how the structure for this question looks like. As mentioned, you can, for example, provide information only for one substance if you have that information, or for a group of substances, or for another substance which is not listed in the list of 50 substances. You here indicate your role in supply chain, and then if you have information for the end use and sector, you may click both, but it really depends on what information is available. And then here in column F, you can provide the lower end of the range on the volumes, and the column G, the upper, in the column H, the lower end of the range, and the column I, the upper end of the range. And finally, in the late and final column, you can include the comments that can provide additional information on the figures included on this sheet. An important point also on the confidentiality. So we would prefer to receive, of course, a non-confidential Excel sheet. So we also try to formulate the questions in a way that, for example, no exact figures need to be reported. But of course, if you need to submit the information is confidential, as mentioned before, there is a section 5 in the web form where this confidential information can be submitted. Also important to note that even if figures are included in the confidential attachments, this can be, for example, used back for deriving non-confidential aggregate figures. So, well, this is all in terms of presentation, and then we can look at the concrete example on how to use the Excel file, and hopefully that will be not too boring. Okay, I will finish this and show. Okay. Okay. So, well, this is the first sheet of the Excel file on uses. So as an example, as I mentioned before, you can select here, for example, the substance of your interest. For example, if you select this substance, then as mentioned before, the CAS number and the substance name and the group will appear automatically. Then here in the column E, you can select your role in the supply chain, for example, downstream user. Regarding end application, for example, we can select in the case some E parts. Then for the second of use, here you can look at indeed the critical applications which are relevant for the use for which you provide information. Then here you should select, for example, the type of the polymer to which this flame retardant is applied. So maybe in this case is ABS or other polymer. As I mentioned before, in case you would like to provide information for the uses which are not listed here, you can include this in the column I, J, or K. In this case, there is no need to fill these cells, for example. Then in the column L, you can select the type of flame retardant, for example, additive. Here you can report the concentration. Please note that only numbers can be reported. So, for example, if you try to include some numbers, this will not be possible because of the validation rules. So only the upper and the lower range of the concentration should be reported. And then here, other function. So, for example, if the substance has other functions, you can select yes. And then this cell will change the color as a reminder that something should be described here, that should be included. And then there is the final column about, yes, the comment. So,
and the other function refers to this specific use.
Exactly. So indeed, the question here needs to be interpreted as that the substance has a function other than a flame retardant in this specific use. So, okay. And then, as mentioned before, for substances, like, for example, for the polymeric flame retardants, for which we don't have a DC number, you can just write the name of the substance, and all the remaining columns are exactly the same. So, yeah.
And for each use, you should, even for the same substance, so for each use, a new row.
Yes. Yeah, for each use, a new row. But of course, if, for example, like all the cells, are the same, and then maybe one adhesive can be used in automotive, aerospace, and rail transport, so you can provide this comment here. And of course, we want to make sure that also this file is practical for you to use. So, okay. Yes, I'm a bit late, 2 minutes, so I will concluded now the presentation. I will stop sharing the screen. Thank you, Pete, and I will give the floor to Tom.
Yeah, so hello there, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are located. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. I just want to give a brief introduction. So my name is Tom Persich. I'm a substitution specialist at Apeiron, but I'll just be facilitating the question and answer session today. We have 4 panelists with us. 3 of those you will already have seen on the screen. So that's Klaus, Nina, and Pete Simson, my colleague. But we're also joined by Matt Griffin from Jaguar Land Rover, which may be able to give some good supply chain perspectives to some of the questions that we've had come in. A polite reminder as well to please continue to post your questions via the question and answer function and not via the chat box. I know there's been a few issues, and we did have one question through where there was an issue with the chat box, but yeah, if you can use the Q&A box, please do so. So yeah, I'll get straight to it. So yeah, we've clarified that the presentation will be shared via BSEF's website, and we've had a number of additional questions coming through as well. First was, and maybe perhaps it's for you, Nina, just to reiterate, I know you probably touched on this in your presentation, I think covered it, but has ECHA published the complete list of impacted flame retardants with CAS numbers? So Nina, did you just want to clarify that one?
Yes, so the substances like that are in the scope for the moment are in the 50 that are included in the background note. However, the list is going to be updated based on the additional information that we hope to receive during the consultation. so the list is not definitive. For example, we hope to receive information on the polymeric flame retardants and all that are used and for which we don't have now the identifier. So when we receive through the first call for evidence information on these additional substances, we will include it. And then for the purpose of the report, so when we will look at emissions, then all the substances identified, so 50 plus those identified during the process will be investigated. Okay. So we don't have for the moment, like I cannot say that we have a finalist now. So just to clarify this.
Okay, thanks very much, Nina. And I'll follow up with another one we've had. So there is a lot of data requested, not a huge amount of time to gather. What is the most critical data to receive as part of the call for evidence? So I think the point is if there is, I guess, limited, if anyone has limited time, where should they focus their efforts in the call for evidence?
Okay, just to clarify, the question is for all the questions or for the questions on the volumes and uses. So the focus. I
think we're focusing on more on the uses. So I'll go for this tab, but maybe if you can't,
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So, well, as mentioned, really an important element of this first call for evidence to have detailed information on the uses, but per substance. And I think the companies and the downstream users are in the best position to inform us about the uses. So we expect when the substance is used is important for polymers. I mean, this information should be readily available. But if we think, for example, about the next call for evidence, which will be an alternatives, and then here I would say that an important thing is that there is communication between the different actors along the supply chain, because when asking questions on the alternatives, we will try indeed to cover different dimensions. So the technical requirements, the economic feasibility, the alternative materials, and especially, for example, for the technical requirements, we would expect that the communication between the supplier of the flame retardants, the other downstream users is critical. Yeah. So this work on the alternatives is a joint work between, of course, the different actors along the supply chain. So maybe this is an important point to consider already now in view of the next call for evidence.
Is any of the other panelists, Pete, Klaus, Matt, anything you'd like, any perspectives you had or would like to add on that?
At least I think Matt might have a perspective, as he's noted something in the question box here that's relevant, I think.
Yeah, I think the issue is not what's most important. It's the difficulty of getting the information for certainly the end users in the supply chain, the assemblers of complex articles. So tonnage information is extremely difficult for us to get at an organisation level. That's only available at company level, and even then they're estimations because of the way we gather our data. So there's a lot of inaccuracies. So we would tend to focus on the substances, the number of hits we have in our record keeping IMDS. To indicate the importance of a substance to us. So that data is readily available. And we've also got to be careful of competition law about gathering the type of information that you're suggesting throughout the whole supply chain. You know, we are constrained by competition law and we're not able to fully investigate through all levels of the supply chain the questions that you're asking. So it's only really a very high level summary that we're able to provide.
Maybe I could add on that just a little bit, Tom, if that's, I mean, I think
that's great.
Matt, you also made another point in the chat, but I don't think anybody else can see that if they're not on the panel. So you mentioned that there is no duty necessarily to declare the presence of a substance if they're not an SVHC, for example. So, you know, the majority or all of the substances that we're discussing really in relation to this activity aren't SVHC, so it might be that end users don't know that they have these substances in the products they're buying, and certainly that they're using in complex articles. So it would be the sort of the intermediate manufacturers of those other articles, perhaps that might need to take a bit more of a role there potentially.
Yeah, and also the third point in that, Peter, that I mentioned is that if we are to have a duty to declare for our suppliers a contractual obligation, they need to know what needs to be declared throughout the whole entire supply chain. And the way we do that is by communicating CAS numbers. So I'm pretty sure we have a lot of brominated polymeric flame retardants in our product, but because there's no CAS numbers, it's going to be the information that we're going to get at the end of it is going to be extremely limited, and I would imagine a really low estimation on the total uses of polymeric flame retardants that we would have. We're not able to describe the substance accurately for our customers. There's no CAS number to refer to, so yeah, it's not on a controlled list that we can easily refer to.
Is there a risk that your customers might report the monomer instead of the polymer?
And they do. So 𝗲𝗶𝗶𝗃, for instance, we have thousands of hits in IMDS. And I think when we were going through this exercise last year, where we were discussing our uses, it was quite clear that about 95% of the reported uses of 𝗲𝗶𝗃 were actually in epoxy resins and wouldn't exist as 𝗲𝗶𝗃. So we only have a very small amount of additive use of 𝗲𝗶𝗃 in our sector.
Yeah. May I just jump on this indeed point, which is very important and linked to the request for information, the concentration. Indeed, because we're asking also the concentration level, and now, for example, for the type of reactive flame retardants, one of the key elements also that we are trying to understand is the share of the unreacted, for example, monomer in the epoxy resins, or of course for the others, flame retardant. So this is why I kind of highlighted indeed the importance of including clarifications in the column, because depending, of course, on how the flame retardant is used, we are talking about different kind of concentrations. So big difference, of course, compared to additives. So yeah, but just.
So just to jump in, if you need the unreacted monomer in the substance, the unreacted flame retardant in a reactive use, then all of our data gathering will not be of any use at all. That can only be done by laboratory analysis, and I don't know whether there is enough time in the study in the call for evidence to complete that. So I think there are studies out there, but we would only have time to rely on existing studies.
Yeah, but I think the exercise. Yeah, sorry, go for it.
Well, sorry, Nina. When I finished again, sorry. Just to note that I think that initial question was noting that the evidence requested was fairly large, and then the deadline in the call for evidence is small, and what could be done and how to prioritise. I think it's difficult to answer that question. I think it's whatever you have, or to at least explain why it's more difficult to get what you have will be important contextual information around those spreadsheets that you're able to get, so you can perhaps understand the difficulties in gathering information. But what I would note is that these information that you're asking for now, it's not going to go away. If you don't get it this time around, it will still be asked as part of an Annex 15 report. It will still be asked as part of opinion making on a proposal if it ever gets that far. So it's for the supply chain to be able to sort of confront these data needs. That's not going to go away at the end of the call for evidence, and maybe we'll highlight a lot of challenges, but equally I think we'll need to be able to overcome some of those challenges at some point to be able to have an informed risk management discussion.
Yeah, and then I mean, just to indeed come back, that of course the key is not now to create new studies, but we really would like to understand what is available today. So what is available today should be provided, but of course knowing all the challenges that you just mentioned. But yeah, so that let's at least, say, get what is there, I would say.
Okay, great, thanks for that 𝗰𝗋𝗹𝗺𝗋. We've had a few, well, I guess, technical, procedural related questions coming through, but one more on in terms of the information that's going to be used was, will the information already present in the registration dossiers of the impacted substances be taken into account? So I didn't know, Nina, if you wanted to add on that point.
Yes, I mean, for the purpose of the report, we will be using different sources. So registration dossier, literature, calls for evidence, like the idea is really to reflect on all the information available, which is relevant for the uses, emissions, and other areas, and then present in this report what we have today on all these different aspects. So yes, I mean, definitely.
Okay, great. And we also have, sorry, as I just scroll through, we have one on end of life. I'll get to that, I think, later. So one question, a second call for evidence is also mentioned. So we've discussed the call for evidence for the spring as well. Should there be, what should I be doing to prepare for this? What should I do if the information that is requested will take time to generate?
Well, I mean, yes, as mentioned before, of course, the topic of alternatives is a complex one, and what we did trying to see also with this first call for evidence, have a meaningful list of the uses to be able to have structured questions to the point, given the uses. So as mentioned before, we will try to investigate different aspects which are relevant to the alternatives. So technical consideration, economic feasibility, different materials, and for the analysis of alternatives, of course, the communication between the suppliers of the substances, and the different actors in the supply chain is critical, because of course, what is supplied by the producers of the substances needs to be assessed by those using, and to see if the alternatives meet or not the requirements. So I would say that it's really important that this communication is already starting now. I mean, if we take for the example of the 𝗄𝗲𝗵𝗿𝗄𝗃 and the use in the printed circuit boards, I mean, we have, of course, many actors, and starting with the epoxy resin producers, and then laminates producer and the complex articles producer. So if at least some of these actors in the supply chain already starts the engagement, so to make sure that we get a consistent information, for example, on the alternatives to 𝗿𝗲𝗵𝗿𝗄𝗃 in the epoxy resin for the laminates. For example, I'm just giving an example to try to make, of course, things a bit concrete. And may I just, Tom, add one point which is not linked to this before I forget? Just a point on the Excel file, because for a few days at the ECHA website there were like some technical problems. So just want to make sure that when people download the Excel file, that they check that the size of the document is 104 kilobyte instead of the 25 megabyte, which so just to make sure this technical issue. So apologize for this. For a few days there were some problems. So I just want to make sure that that the companies are downloading the correct one.
Okay, and I'll try and squeeze in a final question just before we wrap up. So thanks very much. So I saw we had one come through the chat, so I appreciate there's been a few difficulties for some people with the Q&A box, but we have one through on end-of-life considerations. So end-of-life considerations, including the impact on recycling, are part of a holistic view of the circular economy. Why is this not considered at this stage in the call for evidence process, and will this be considered later on? So maybe as part of those
this is indeed one of the questions in the calls for evidence, and there is indeed a specific file on this. So it is one of the key elements. Yeah, the recycling, waste management. Of course, we didn't discuss a lot today this part of the calls for evidence, but it is an area that will be definitely addressed in the report.
Okay, thank you very much, Nina.
I know you're trying to
maybe this
tidy
would
up.
be a good opportunity to inform participants that BSEF has set up a comprehensive work program also to generate background information, which could help support the evaluation here. And we are, among other things, we're looking into alternatives also, and we hope we will get feedback from downstream users here. So just to alert you that this is also ongoing, and hopefully we can work together there.
Great. Yep, thank you very much, Klaus. So yeah, thank you for all the questions received. I appreciate that we couldn't respond to absolutely everything that has come through, but I'm sure you'll appreciate the timing considerations that we had. So I'll pass on now to Klaus to wrap up. Sorry, to Peter to wrap up, and I wish you all a pleasant day.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I think Klaus will have the final word, but I just have a couple of concluding remarks just to make. The first, I suppose, building on what Klaus had said, that BSEF are active to try and take on some of these tasks around analysis of alternatives. But of course, BSEF is sort of a top-down organisation. If you're a downstream user and you want to try and contribute to those studies, then I think reach out to BSEF and perhaps you'll be able to get involved in some way or other. There might be questionnaires flowing down supply chains, but they're notoriously difficult to actually punch through to the lower level. So if anyone's listening and they want to be involved in those studies around alternatives and impacts, then I would suggest that they reach out to Klaus at BSEF, and his contact details are on the website and on this final slide here. But very briefly, in terms of summarising, I would say that the flame retardant strategy is the basis for all of this. It's acknowledging that potentially different regulatory outcomes are possible for different types of brominated flame retardants. We're in a process here that will last at least 5 years, plenty of time to generate information, and particularly what will happen will be dependent on hazard properties, whether or not they're confirmed. There'll be issues about reactive and polymeric BFRs at their end of life. Are they releasing substances, for example, while they're recycled? And I did notice a question in the Q&A asking if reactive 𝗲𝗶𝗶𝗃 is out of scope. It's certainly not out of scope of this investigation phase. And if you have information on those uses, then they can be plugged into those spreadsheets. The investigation study is underway. They want to address these open questions, and equally, the call for evidence is establishing the scope of the analysis of alternatives and socio-economic impact assessment that will happen as part of this investigation report, but also further along the lines of the process as well, if it does turn into a restriction proposal. And the investigation study is very important to see how quickly it does move on through the regulatory process and what sort of scope of future risk management is actually going to be considered. So it's very important, again, this investigation phase in setting the path onwards to how and what this future risk management around aromatic brominated flame retardants might look like. And then I think just to emphasise again that this early intervention is really key now to shape how things move forward. And even if you can't get involved, I think we're raising awareness that this is happening. Those information needs, whilst they might be difficult to address now, are not going away, and this is something really to keep in mind for the future. Just to wrap up practically now, that's the end of the content for today. The recordings will be made available on the BSEF website, and presumably also the presentations as well. Thank you very much for your attention. One final quite important thing to mention, I asked about stakeholders reaching out to BSEF and getting involved if they're interested. One way that you can perhaps help is that if you make a submission to the ECHA consultation and you also make that publicly available yourself on your own website, for example, and this is a non-confidential document, of course, then please inform BSEF that you've done this, just so that they can look to see what other actors are contributing to this call for evidence, and it will really help when it comes to informing this work programme that's ongoing at the moment. So if you are planning on making your consultation response publicly available, please do inform BSEF about that. But thank you very much for me. It's been a pleasure to speak to you all today and answer some of your questions. I'll hand over now to Klaus. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Yeah, we introduced it already, our work program, and Pete also mentioned it. So if you can, please share relevant information with us. My email address is here on the last slide. And yeah, the only thing left is to thank everybody for attending. Thanks to Apeiron for supporting us in that, and thanks to our colleagues from ECHA for joining us and explaining the core of evidence. Thanks, everybody, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.